Dear participants, Namaste and good afternoon. Welcome to the NICE Economic Lecture Series. Through NICE Economic Lecture Series, we aim to invite eminent economists to discuss the contemporary economic issues. Before we start, let me briefly introduce NICE. Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is a research think tank registered under the Companies Act 2006 of Nepal, working towards bringing in research excellence in the field of international relations, international economy, security, and development, and looking for better approaches for enhanced international cooperation and relations for a better, peaceful, and stable world. To talk about today's important issues, Sri Lankan economic crisis and role of remittance and tourism, we have Dr. Bilesha Weeraratne from the Institute of Policy Studies of Sri Lanka. Dr. Bilesha is a research fellow and head of migration and urbanization research at the Institute of Policy Studies of Sri Lanka. Previously, Dr. Bilesha was a postdoctoral research associate at Princeton University, New Jersey, USA. Prior to moving to the United States, she worked at the IPS at the University of Colombo, Sri Lanka. Dr. Bilesha holds a BA in economics from the University of Colombo, Sri Lanka, an MA in economics from Rutgers University, USA, and an MPhil and PhD in economics from the City University of New York, USA. Her research interests include internal and international migrations, urbanization, economics of education, labor economics, economics development, econometrics, and economic modeling, and economics of sports. She has been a consultant to the prominent international organizations such as the International Organization for Migrations, IOM, the International Labour Organization, ILO, the World Bank, and the Asian Development Bank. She is a member of the Expert Committee for Establishment of Social Security Scheme for Migrant Workers at Ministry of Skills Development, Employment and Labour Relations since 2020. She is a member of the expert group of formulating the revised National Labour Migration Policy, member of the National Advisory Committee on Labour Migration in Sri Lanka, 2014 June onwards, and member of the Programme Advisory Committee of the Ministry of Foreign Employment for promoting decent work through good governance, protection, and empowerment of migrant workers, ensuring the effective implementation of the Sri Lankan National Labour Migration Policy. She has published several articles in reputed international journals and edited volumes. She has presented her research at national and international conferences. Dr. Bilesha Weeraratne, you have around 35 to 40 minutes to make your initial remarks, and which will be followed by the questions and answers. This session is of 16 minutes, and the program is streaming live on several Facebook pages and social media platforms. We would like to request all our participants to tweet about the SHAPE event and also share our live video on their social media so that maximum can benefit from the discussion. The audience can drop in their questions under the Facebook Live or in Zoom chat. Dr. Bilesha, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting me and giving me the opportunity. And I'm very pleased to be here with you all today this afternoon. So let me start sharing my screen. Can you all see my screen? Yes?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. So the topic that is given to me is the Sri Lankan economic crisis, the role of remittances and tourism. I think this is largely a South Asian audience, and you all would have heard by now what sort of an issue Sri Lanka is going through. So before I start, I just want to tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to walk you through in chronological order about what happened in Sri Lanka and how we got to this crisis today in terms of remittances and tourism, focusing on those two mainly. So most of you all already know that Sri Lanka went through two major shocks in recent times. One was the Easter attacks in 2019, and then the COVID-19 pandemic that we all went through. So what I want to do is first talk about the the situation before and immediately after these two specific shocks in how the economy reacted, and then talk about these deep-rooted economic issues that it's in Sri Lanka that contributed to this ongoing crisis, and then of course talk about the economic crisis from the perspective of remittances and tourism, and then finally wrap it up by looking at the role of remittances and tourism to provide possible solutions to come out of this crisis. So let's start off with, so I want to pick 2018 for a reason, because 2018 was the last good year that Sri Lanka had before these shocks and issues coming in. So in 2018, there was no major issue in remittances or tourism. So remittances, we received over $7 billion in remittances. And in terms of South Asian context, this might be small. I know India gets about 80 billion, I think that is closer to our entire GDP. But even though it is small relative to the rest of the South Asian region, for Sri Lanka, it's massive. It makes a huge contribution. So in terms of our 88 billion GDP in 2018, remittances accounted for about 8% of it. And remittance was the highest foreign exchange earner for Sri Lanka. And then similarly, tourism earned about 4.4 billion US dollars in the same year. And it accounted for about 5% of the GDP and was the third highest foreign exchange earner. And the tourism sector also provided a lot of employment opportunities, closer to 400,000, and a lot on indirect employment also, not directly working in the tourism sector, and indirect employment also. So come 2019, January, February, March went by as normal. There were natural cyclicality in tourism arrivals. And this quarter, the first quarter of 2019 was the highest, recorded the highest arrivals ever in Sri Lanka, with a lot of arrivals coming, and tourism was booming in Sri Lanka. And before the pandemic, before the Easter attack, the average arrivals per day was 7,600. This was huge in Sri Lanka. And then when the Easter attack,
ma'am, can you unmute yourself?
All right. Can you all hear me now?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. Okay. So when the Easter attacks took place, immediately there were so many cancellations happening in terms of reservations that were made to Sri Lanka. And one research institute has shown that within the first 3 days after the Easter attack, 86% of the existing bookings were cancellations went up by 86%. And then new bookings also declined very rapidly. And after that, the average daily arrivals dropped to a mere 1,700 a day. And all in all, annual arrivals declined by 18% in 2018 relative to the previous year, and recorded only 1.9 million tourists coming into the country. And earnings also declined by 17.7% to only record 3.6, I'm sorry, it should be billion, not million, billion dollars. So just before I go to this, I want to show now April was the COVID-19 pandemic, but gradually towards May and December, tourism was picking up in Sri Lanka along with the seasonality also. And then in 2020, as you see in this graph, by January, tourism was at a good level again. And then February, there was a little bit of a slide because of the seasonality. And then come the COVID-19 pandemic, which started affecting the global economy before the South Asian region. Other regions were affected, and then slowly the arrivals were affected, and February, March were going down. And on March 18, Sri Lanka closed its borders for foreign tourists to come in. So then there was no tourism at all. So as a result of that, you can see the nosedive in tourism and the flatlining after April, and there was very minimal tourist activity in Sri Lanka. And as a result, direct and indirect employment also went down in the industry, mainly indirect employment. These are the people who might be supplying goods or, eatables or doing these auxiliary services to the tourism industry. So they were the most affected. Next, we will look at how migration and remittances go. Now, in 2019, there was no issue for migration or remittances as such. But in up to 2020, departures from Sri Lanka were kind of experiencing a natural decline. And on average, it was about over 200,000 departures per year. This decline was mainly due to the destinations that Sri Lankan go to the Middle East, decline in economic activities in the Middle East and other global situations. And along with these departures, because of the characteristics of the migrants leaving Sri Lanka, they are temporary migrants leaving their family behind, and they are mostly low-skilled workers. So they are not thinking of permanent migration. And the destinations that they go to the Middle East do not allow permanent migration. So they are very much temporary migration. So this temporary migration is always associated with a corresponding inflow of remittances to the country of origin, because they leave the family at home and go. So therefore, Sri Lanka was getting remittances. By 2019, we had passed around 7 billion, and we were in the range of $7 billion a year. And on average, if we look at the micro level household, a household would receive about 40,000 Sri Lankan rupees. And when you look at the households as a percentage of total households in Sri Lanka, over 7% of the households had a migrant. And more interestingly, there were more households getting remittances than having migrants. So there were nearly 9% of households in Sri Lanka receiving remittances. So some of them didn't even have a migrant, but still benefited from remittances. So in 2020, we know there was the pandemic impact occurred around March and April, and April remittances declined very much in Sri Lanka. And it went to an all-time low. And over April, May, June, it started picking up. However, despite these monthly up and down, in early times, even the World Bank predicted that Sri Lanka will record a decline in remittances for 2020. But somehow, there were more remittances coming in for various reasons. And overall, 2020 recorded a positive growth in remittances to Sri Lanka. So some of these reasons were that people transferred from informal channels to formal channels during the pandemic. And also people wanted to, we know remittances are said to be counter-cyclical. So when there was issues in the country, the migrants wanted to help their families back, and they sent more remittances possibly. So some of the facts are these, and there are other reasons also. If we have time, we can discuss about this later. And then with this context of migration and remittances up to 2020, let's look at how the deep-rooted economic issues in the Sri Lankan economy contributed to the ongoing situation. So while the tourism and the remittances suffered due to these external or exogenous shocks, there were these issues, there were critical issues in the Sri Lankan economy. One was this poor macroeconomic fundamentals, where we were running heavy fiscal deficits for many years. And on top of it, in November, a big tax cut was declared by the new incumbent government. And then we are coming out of the 30-year war in Sri Lanka. So there was a heavy boom for investment and economic growth. But then much of this growth was supported by heavy borrowing from the capital markets and issuing of sovereign bonds and reaching out to new lenders. So in this context, majority of these borrowings went into public investment, which had little return in the immediate term, which contributed to any capacity to repay this borrowed money. And so because of these issues, when the two exogenous shocks occurred, the Easter attack and the COVID-19, the Sri Lankan economy was not in a good position to cushion itself from these external vulnerabilities. So we were very much prone to get disturbed by the situation that is going on. So if you see in these, in the table also, we can see in the second column, you see GDP growth rate was gradually declining over time. And then the budget deficit was also considerable high. And the external debt was kind of going up over time when you look at up to 2019. And the debt to GDP ratio was also increasing significantly. And we've been traditionally having a trade deficit. So these issues made it very difficult for Sri Lankan economy to weather the effects of the Easter attack and then the mounting pressure from the COVID-19 pandemic, which was affecting the rest of our buyers or our markets or entire economy, global economy. And on top of that, there were other issues also that contributed to this situation in Sri Lanka. So there was one, there were many, I will not have time to talk about everything. So I will pick a few. So one is this decision to ban chemical fertilizer in Sri Lanka. So while no other very heavy agriculture, economic oriented countries also have not tried this totally switching from chemical fertilizer to natural fertilizer, but for some reason, Sri Lanka made the decision and switched. And it backfired heavily. It lowered our crop yield significantly, now to the point of having a food security issue in the country also. And then also, along with all these ongoing issues, there was the Sri Lankan economy was not functioning well, and there was need to continuous money printing, which resorted to building up inflationary pressures in the country. And then also over many years, Sri Lanka had not prepared for energy security, and we rely heavily on imported fuel to survive or to power for power generation during the dry season in the country. And on top of that, we have other heavy reliance on imports for very essential items like food, medicine, and inputs for exports also. So this all made it very difficult for the exports to go up or the normal economy to function, because the inputs were relying a lot on imports. And amidst all of this, now there was building pressure on the currency. And so now the economy was struggling, and our exports were struggling. So without enough exports, we are not getting export income and dollars back into the country. And now, as I said, there were lots of migrant workers who returned to Sri Lanka because of the pandemic. And many migrant workers couldn't take up new jobs. So the stock of migrants was going down. And then as a result, the capacity to remit also was being affected. And then, as you all saw, already tourism was flatlining. So these are the key sectors that we get foreign exchange from. So there was a huge decrease in the foreign exchange coming into the economy. And however, we had to continue to spend on importing all these things that were very essential. And on top of that, now we had borrowed heavily in the foreign market. So we had to do this debt repayment. So we were under obligation to pay it. And on top of that, we also had this mentality to defend the currency. So all in all, it was getting very, very difficult and very tight in terms of foreign reserves in Sri Lanka to manage the economy. And there was more and more pressure building towards currency depreciation. But the central bank held the currency around 198 to 202 with greatest difficulty. So what is the greatest difficulty? Excessive intervention in the foreign exchange market. So they had to keep, pumping money to defend the currency, depleting the reserves in Sri Lanka. And there was excessive regulations trying to hold this exchange rate without letting it depreciate. So as a result of this excessive regulation, there were parallel foreign exchange markets emerging. As you can see from this graph over here, the yellow line shows the the formal market or white market, if we call it, the licensed commercial bank rate for foreign currency, which was about around 198 to 202. But then there were other agents like authorized money exchanges. Now, these are not illegal entities, these are legal entities, but they were quoting higher rates. So they were like a gray market, I call it. So they were offering to the tune of 230 or 240 rupees, while the commercial banks were giving like 200. So there was a huge gap between the formal rate and the outside rate. And on top of it, there was the total black market also, which was operating. They were offering almost very closer to 250 or more. So this huge gap between the formal and the informal market made it very lucrative for informal remittances to happen, for informal activities to happen, and the recorded remittances to go down because of that. So if you look at this chart, you can see on the top one, we see the buying and selling rates. During the pandemic, this peak is the depreciation during the pandemic, initially during March, April in 2020. And at that time, remittances to Sri Lanka declined significantly. And then there is a portion where it's almost like a stability. And that time remittances were also somewhat stable. And then start the depreciation pressure again, and then the remittances decline. But then when the central bank purposely, very consciously defended the foreign exchange rate, ideally the remittances should have also kind of stabilized, like somewhere here. But what happened was remittances did not stabilize. Remittances kept going down, meaning the formal remittances went down. So there is a high probability of this region, like what we can identify like a triangle, would have gone into informal channels. Why did this happen? Because there was a lot of confusion and lack of confidence within about the formal system. One was, of course, with this heavy depreciation and heavy pressure to depreciate, and the central bank holding it by force, there was anticipation that there will be a future depreciation, and people didn't want to send remittances but wanted to hold it and send later. And then also there was these various regulations saying that personal foreign currency account holders' funds in those, dollar currency funds in those, will have to be compulsorily converted. So this created a fear in people to send money in future, because they were scared that their money will be converted by force. And on top of it, it was ideally supposed to be, initially supposed to be only for foreign exchange earnings from exports. And later on it became services also, but it was never for remittances, worker remittances. But there was confusion, and there was no clear methodology to distinguish money in an account which came from remittances versus money in an account which came from exports or exports of goods or services. So because of that, some banks had sent letters to migrant workers' families saying that your funds have to be converted, and this sort of confusion created a lack of confidence, and many remitters didn't want to send money to Sri Lanka during that time through the formal channels. So some were able to revert to informal channels, and the informal channels were thriving because of that. And some other migrants who had the capacity to hold back their remittances or keep it with them and send it later did so. And then there were some other migrants who had accounts in other foreign countries. They sent money to their other accounts in other countries instead of sending to Sri Lanka. So overall, what happened was in 2021, Sri Lanka experienced a decline in remittances to Sri Lanka. So if we look at the tourism sector in 2021, now tourism sector was inching away and coming up a little bit because the pandemic, the initial wave was over after December, and then tourist arrivals were starting to pick up after Sri Lanka opened the borders for tourist arrivals in January. So as you can see in the bottom corner of this graph, arrivals started picking up from February, May. But again, in April, there was another wave of COVID wave in Sri Lanka, and Sri Lanka had to close down tourism from April to June. So again, there was a little dip. But after September, there was a steady climb in tourism. And however, despite this steady climb in the latter part of the year, from 2021 overall, tourism only recorded a decline. So now we come to the economic crisis that we are facing now. It's, I'm sure most of you would have heard and read about it. It's very devastating and very heartbreaking to see and to experience it being in Sri Lanka right now. So some of the issues that we are going through right now is a severe shortage for fuel. both for transportation, petrol, diesel, as well as cooking fuel. Kerosene is in short, LP gas is in short, and people have to spend hours, and now it has come into days to secure petrol, diesel, kerosene, or gas for their personal consumption. And now I also said there was a ban on fertilizer. So because of that, there's a shortage in fertilizer, there's less crops, and there's food shortage significantly in the country. And with the shortage of fuel in the country, there is daily power cuts. Earlier, it went up to about 12, 13 hours a day. It was unbearable. I don't think I can explain it in words how uncomfortable and how difficult it is for the daily life. And now the daily power cuts have come down a little bit, but still we have 2 to 3 hour daily power cuts. And then earlier, initially work from home and virtual schooling started because of the pandemic. But now the pandemic fears are not there in Sri Lanka that much. It is still there, but it is not a major concern right now. But now work from home and virtual schooling is becoming critical or cannot do with because of this fuel shortage, transportation crisis, and the power crisis, and all sorts of other piling on issues in the country. So now, as of now, school children have missed so many days of schooling because of the pandemic, and they were just about to start picking up and catching up on that loss. And now again, schools had to be closed in urban areas because of this transport crisis. Right now, they are on virtual schooling from home in Colombo schools mostly for 2 weeks, and this is the first week going. This is not pandemic related, this is purely the crisis related. And on top of that, government servants are given extra days off, like Fridays are given off, so that it will ease off the pressure for transportation and other issues. And going through all this, there is frequent protests in various parts of the country because it's unbearable. There are various lines. People in these queues waiting for fuel will, flare up and erupt into fights or into protests, and there is ongoing continuous protests in various parts of the country. And then amidst this, there was a massive currency depreciation, which I will explain a little more detail in the next slide. But with this massive currency depreciation, because we rely a lot on imported goods, there is a heavy inflationary pressure. And also, we all know what's going on in the global economy. Prices are rising due to this geopolitical tension and various. So we have a compounded effect on fuel costs going up, exchange rate depreciation, and piling up of each of it. There is a heavy, very heavy, unbearable inflation going on in the country right now. So going through all this, finally, Sri Lanka defaulted external debt in 2022. We had not defaulted ever before, but I think it was better late than never, and we defaulted. And now we're trying to, as all of you know, restructure our debt with the help of the IMF. So in that context, we are receiving a lot of bilateral aid from many South Asian friendly countries and other non-South Asian countries as well as international organizations. So to tell you more about the exchange rate depreciation that took place in 2022, if you look at this chart, you can see how strong the central bank was attempting to hold the exchange rate. There was a flat line going on till March, despite all informal markets working, all pressures coming, spending more and more reserves, the central bank defended the currency. And on March 8th, it depreciated from 202 to about 230 Sri Lankan rupees per dollar. And from 9th and 10th of March, it allowed for a free float, and that is when you see the first 2 steps. After that, there is a free float and a free fall of the currency, Sri Lankan currency. But some stability was acquired again after the central bank management and the governor was changed, and some new monetary policy mechanisms were introduced. Right now, we have something like a crawling peg, which does not allow so much depreciation. So I think I mentioned about these goods prices and the geopolitical issues earlier. And now, with the exchange rate depreciated, ideally, this should be a very lucrative moment for migrants to send remittances, because for each dollar you send, your family will get more rupees. So ideally, remittances should go up. But what we see is not that. When we look at this last column, we see that monthly remittances to Sri Lanka in 2022 is significantly lower than the previous year's corresponding months. This is in the context of a reasonable amount of departures taking place also. Now in 2020 and 2021, the departures for this first 5 to 6 months was very low. But in 2022, we have caught up and we have sent over 130,000 migrants from January to yesterday. With such a lot of migrants going out, still the remittances coming in is slow. So this is again connecting to that idea we said that people don't want to send money through formal channels due to various reasons. Now, we have discussed about the reasons why they want to wait, if the currency will depreciate further, or they don't have trust in the government, and all sorts of various things. So what we find now is an interesting phenomena where normally we say remittances are counter-cyclical. But now during the pandemic, we have another pandemic. After the pandemic, the crisis, this economic crisis that Sri Lanka is going through, we have come to see that all remittances are not counter-cyclical. We have seen that formal remittances have somewhat become pro-cyclical. So if in this figure, you can see the business cycle with the boom and the bust. And so if there's a recession, ideally, if remittances are counter-cyclical, as shown in the purple line, the remittances should go up. But our formal remittances don't go up. What happens is formal remittances are pro-cyclical, and that is also going down. Now, this is a new scenario for Sri Lanka. But on the other hand, what we see is what is counter-cyclical is the informal component of the remittances, because we have emerging evidence saying that migrant households are still getting the same amount of funds, not through the formal channels, by these alternative mechanisms. And so these households are not affected by the crisis as much as the non-migrant households, because they can maintain some level of consumption because they get more rupee value for the dollars that their migrants send. So by not sending remittances through the formal channel, and instead of being counter-cyclical and being pro-cyclical, what the remitters or the migrants are doing is they're sending a very strong signal to the Sri Lankan state or the government. They're reflecting their displeasure. Some of this is vehemently mentioned in various portals and all, where they say until there is stability in the country, until there is the corruption is fixed, we are not going to send money back through the formal channels. So this is a very strong signal that the remitters are sending to the economy to fix the economic problems, to fix the social problems, to fix the political problems in the country. So in this context, with formal remittances not coming in as much as we want, now it is kind of contributing to a vicious cycle of low remittances, low formal remittances, because with lower formal remittances, the external sector issues are aggravated because we don't have funds, we don't have dollars to buy the essential imports. And there is excess demand for forex, and then there's more pressure for depreciation and further macroeconomic issues. And then again, with all these prices rising, there's more social issues, more economic issues, there's more political instability. With all of this, again, it comes back to lower interest or lower intention or lower necessity or wanting of the migrants or the remitters to send money through the formal channel. So we have to break this vicious cycle. In my opinion, the best way to do is to show some stability, show some change in economic policy, in political situation. Until then, these are short-term fixes that we will be doing. So all in all, to come and wrap up 2022, we see that in terms of migration, we see that the monthly migration departure statistics we see in the orange line in 2022, we see the high numbers. These are flat lines because I had to take monthly averages for quarters. So, but anyhow, we can see that these are high numbers compared to previous months. Despite such high numbers, we still get lower monthly remittances due to the reasons that we discussed. And when we look at monthly tourism arrivals and earnings, after flatlining in 2021, 2022 beginning, it started off with the seasonality of arrivals. So there is a dip, but more than that, the economic situation in the country, the uncertainty, all are contributing to affect the tourism sector in Sri Lanka also. So I want to come to the last section, the role of remittances and tourism for economic revival in Sri Lanka. So to increase formal remittances, number one of the, there are many ways. One of the ways to address is to increase the number of migrants outside who can remit to Sri Lanka. So Sri Lanka has relied heavily on these temporary migrant departures, and they were very helpful in sending remittances back to the country. So now we have to push for the migration numbers to go up, the departure numbers to go up. So some of the ways to do is to enter into new memorandum of understanding with destination countries and look at new markets. So in this context, a lot of effort is taken by the relevant officials and the institutions. New agreements have been signed, or understandings have been entered into with Japan, with UK for better skilled opportunities like nurses or healthcare workers. So these new skills groups and new markets will give opportunity for more remittances to come into Sri Lanka than the traditional markets and the traditional lower skilled group workers. And also recently there was a new initiative where a cabinet paper was approved to allow government sector workers to take no pay leave from their government service, and go outside and work. And this will not affect their seniority or their pension. So this is a very attractive offer for the public sector workers also to go out and work. And it'll be a win-win. They can earn more money, earn dollars, get good exposure, and the country will benefit from their remittances. But for all of these to happen, we have to facilitate the high migration costs. Now, with the depreciation of the dollar, this depreciation of the Sri Lankan rupee against the dollar, the airfare cost, the recruitment cost for migration has become exorbitant. And understanding that Sri Lankans right now seeking foreign employment are going through a severe economic crisis, they might not have money to spend on all these recruitment costs. So it is very important to provide some funds or some support for them to facilitate this recruitment or the migration attempt so that they can take up foreign employment and send back remittances to the country. And then also there are various proposals provided to increase remittances. These include saying if you send a certain amount of remittances, you might get a duty relief or a permit to import a vehicle. Right now, vehicle importation is stopped in Sri Lanka due to foreign currency issues. And they may be offering tax reliefs and low interest rate loans, and also preference to enter into schools for migrants' children, and then some sort of discount cards for consumables. So these are some of the proposals. Not everything is being properly implemented yet. And then also another very key area to consider when increasing remittances is handling informal remittances. So now, informal remittances coming into the country will contribute to the household at the micro level when it is disbursed in rupee terms. But at the macro level, for the economy to come out of this economic crisis, it is very important that we get formal remittances. That is what we can use to repair debt, or that is what we can use to import fuel or import inputs for our exports and improve our economy and get the economy back in business. So to now a large chunk of the remittances are coming through informal channels. So to divert from informal to formal has to be handled very tactfully. If you put too many regulations and try to clamp it down too much, it might create an environment for greater informality, and it might go deeper down underground and operate in a more dangerous manner. So when the government or the state institutions are trying to handle informal remittances, we have to understand that informal remittances are very resilient, and they have been operating for like 1 or 2 centuries. And so they know how to operate despite all these challenges. So it has to be handled tactfully, not trying to clamp them down and drive them further underground, but gently, gradually convert or divert informal remittances into formal remittances without making it totally counterproductive to this effort. And then finally, I want to look at how the tourism sector is affected by the current issues. So now, by 2022, the tourism sector has kind of recovered from the previous 2 shocks, from the Easter attack as well as the COVID-19 pandemic for a large extent. But now it is struggling because of the ongoing economic crisis. Not only the economic crisis, the current low arrivals to Sri Lanka is partly because of the economic crisis, where there is no regular supply of food, there is no fuel, therefore there's shortages in essential goods, medicine, or transportation issues in the country. And also there is political uncertainty in the country. There is continuous unrest, protests, and social issues in the country. So with all these going on, many countries have issued negative travel advisories over Sri Lanka. So this is driving down arrivals to Sri Lanka. So this is something we have to change, not to convince the other countries to change their advisories, but to do some concrete changes in the country to show that Sri Lanka is safe. There is no uncertainty. Sri Lanka has enough fuel and there is no transport crisis. So these changes have to come through to attract more and more tourists into the country. And also on top of that, there are certain things which is beyond our control, the global issues. The geopolitical tension that is going on is also contributing, and also the related shortage of products in the global market and the related price rising is contributing to the disposable income of the potential travelers, and that is also affecting our arrival numbers. So with that, I come to my final slide. So to revive the tourist industry, recently a new minister was appointed, and a plan for quick recovery was introduced called Revival for Survival by a group of stakeholders in the industry. So it aims to bring arrivals for the remaining months of 2022 to about 800 to 850,000. So hopefully it is achievable. And some of the key areas focused in this revival plan is to reverse the negative travel advisories and prioritize fuel, gas, and electricity to hotels, and target risk-averse destination countries of origin of tourists to Sri Lanka, like India and Middle East, Russia, and market aggressively to attract these travelers to Sri Lanka. And also, in the same light, there is a new travel tourism act that is being introduced, and there is a lot of promotional activities going on. But as I said before, I think we have to put our house in order to attract further travelers to Sri Lanka. So with that, thank you very much for your time. I close my presentation. Thank you. We can't hear you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Bilesha Weeraratne, for insightful and thoughtful presentation. And we will move now to the question answers. So dear participants, if you have questions, you can raise your hand or you can drop in the chat box. Meanwhile, I will take some questions from the registration that I have got. Dr. Bilesha, I will read out the questions to you. Yeah, the first question is from Neeraj Kumar Singh. Why did Sri Lankan government not take necessary steps to save economic crisis before the country led to the current situation? Is it a government failure or cause of pandemic? And that's the first question. We will take 3 questions and then you can answer them. And the next question is from Mukesh. And what are the challenges or lessons for the other South Asian countries, like can learn from the Sri Lankan crisis? And another question from Richard, like what is the role of Chinese government in Sri Lankan contemporary economic situations? So let's go with first three questions, then we will see others. Please unmute yourself.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for those very thought-provoking questions. So the first one was, why didn't the Sri Lankan government do anything to save from the crisis? That is $1 million question. It was coming. We saw it. Many people were warning, but the warnings were not heard. I think, in my personal opinion, there was a lot of bad advising going to the final decision makers. The proper situation, the gravity of the situation was not properly communicated to the final decision makers. And maybe the decision makers were not willing to listen to the advice given. I really don't know. But largely, it was nothing that came by surprise. Many economists have been indicating that this is an impending situation. It is coming. It could have been prevented on many stages. We know it took so long for us to reach out to the IMF. If the IMF support was sought a little bit earlier, a lot of the issues would have been prevented. So I think that was the political will to acknowledge there is a crisis and the political will to address the impending crisis. That was lacking. That is what contributed to this crisis. And with that, I think we can nicely move into the second question, which is about what are the lessons. The lessons is, please listen to the experts when they give warning signs of some impending economic issue that is coming that can be prevented. And when they give solutions, try to understand how these can be factored in to prevent. There are experts, not only economic experts, the agriculture sector experts were vehemently opposing about this ban on fertilizer, but that was also, that just continued unheard. And now finally it was reversed at a very later stage when all the damage was done. So I think that leadership has to have the ability to listen to the experts, to listen to the advisors and take the advice. That's why there are advisors, and to have good advisors who can understand the situation, who are thorough about their expert area, and who can make a valuable contribution. So other countries also maybe can benefit by learning how to handle these situations. And then the third question was, what is the role of China in government's current situation? I would not really want to say it is the role of China. I think it was the role of the leadership in Sri Lanka reaching out to China. So there was a lot of borrowing done by China. And some of it was commercial basis borrowing. So that made it like if the borrowing was done by these multilateral institutions, there would have been better checks and balances to look at the viability of the projects that were borrowed and whether they had the repaying capacity. So that sort of lapses were there in some of these commercial type borrowings. And yes, so I think it is largely to do with the political leadership who went to borrow rather than the country who wanted to help us when we were borrowing money. Yes, any other questions?
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much for the thoughtful answers. There is a question from Kathy Anand. Kathy, do you want to ask yourself or do you want me to read it out?
Hello, sir. Am I audible?
Yes.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening, ma'am. Thank you so much for the lecture. Ma'am, my question is that amid the ongoing crisis in Sri Lanka, like whatever the people are facing, they are struggling right now to meet their ends, right? So how are the changes that you previously suggested to boost the tourism? How is it going to help, you know, people to attract tourism? Because people Like, I would like to give an honest, a recent example from my life. Actually, my cousin, she had planned to visit Sri Lanka. And just before the economic and the turmoil which happened, she had to cancel all of her plans. So how are the changes going to, attract the tourists and, better the situation in the country, and for the, you know, how is it going to help Sri Lanka? The changes that you suggested further, because people are really going to fear the economic and the political situation and the change of the leadership in Sri Lanka. Thank you.
Thank you for that good question. So as I said, I strongly believe we have to put our house in order. We have to put our economy in order. We have to put our social issues in order. Then only we can properly convince visitors, tourists to come to Sri Lanka. I said it is not going to work that we convince countries to change their advisories. No, that is not the way. We have to make some tangible, some concrete changes within the economy. So I think the steps are falling into place. It's like a chicken and egg situation. Until the remittances come, until the tourists come, until the dollars come, we can't bring the fuel. Until the fuel come, the shortages are not going to be sorted out, and the economic situation is not going to be sorted out. So these are all vicious cycle contributing to discourage tourists coming in. So we have to break it. The way to break it is have some political stability, have some economic stability, and to do that is now the path is kind of started. The IMF team is here in Sri Lanka currently, and then other key country teams are also here to talk with them concurrently. So hopefully by end of July, that is what we hear, by end of July, there will be a some sort of preliminary arrangement for this IMF debt restructuring process. So there onwards, once we get the IMF endorsement for our debt restructuring, that will give some credibility for our plans, for our efforts to put our house in order. That will give the right signals to the international community, to the international traveler, that Sri Lanka is committed to change the situation and to improve the situation. Then only the things will really fall into place and start moving in a positive direction. So until then, it is going to be a very stop and go slow process of borrowing from here and there to meet the ends. Did I answer you properly?
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, I have another question, which is not very economic in nature. It is related to the political. I wanted to ask, what is the outlook of people in Sri Lanka currently towards the Rajpakshas?
I defer to answer that because I will not be representing the entire population, so I'm not in a position to respond to that. I respectfully decline.
It's okay, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. There is Dr. Savitri. Do you want to ask the question by yourself? Okay, I will read it out then. There's a question from Dr. Savitri, like, is this the example of leadership failure or a kind of nepotism? That's the question. And another question, we'll go through that from the Mohan Lohani. How far is political leadership responsible for the ongoing economic crisis? So I would like to add something in that, like it was in 2019 December, I think that the current political parties that make a political agenda of tax cuts. So is this a cheap political agenda or manifesto that led to the country in this situation? Yeah, ma'am.
Okay, so I'll start with the last part of your question. The tax cuts contributed. It was not the sole reason. There were many parts contributing together to make this big mess. Not one thing made the mess. Everything was piling on top of each other and created the mess. So, so the tax cut contributed heavily because there was not enough revenue to the government. In the absence of revenue, only there was need to print money over and over again. So with that, we go back to the other part of it about political leadership and other nuances of it, let me call it. Yes, if there was good political leadership, this problem would have been averted to a large extent. That I strongly believe. Other nuances of political corruption is also high in Sri Lanka. I think all of you all know to a large extent. So these all contributed to this ongoing crisis. As I said just now, not only one, there were various elements coming in and converging towards creating this crisis. All contributed, all made a different level of a contribution, but everything mattered finally in resulting in this crisis. Did I successfully answer your by not really approaching the question?
Thank you, Matt. There's a long description by Francis Solomon. His statement I'm going to read. Thanks, Dr. Bilesha, for your valuable input. In terms of labor migration policy, the Sri Lanka government has widened the scope for aspirants, including government officials, to take up overseas employment in order to harmonize the prevailing situations. So since you have mentioned that recent development on unfolding MOUs and bilateral for emerging markets, a large number of aspirants attempt to land in the major destination countries without undergoing any regulatory process. Unfortunately, destination countries are strengthening their nationalization policies to integrate local workforce into domestic labor market, and on the other side, easing economies. What is your take on such situation that you believe will attribute towards the measures the Sri Lankan government wants to achieve?
I think there is some to the point of your concern about nationalization, but I think still these countries will not be able to fully get rid of foreign workers, the Middle East region. So there is still high demand. We see a lot of job orders coming into Sri Lanka to the other countries also now. So I think the demand for the South Asian workers is not going to go dry all of a sudden. These nationalization attempts have been made previously, many years ago. What happens is, as soon as there's a crisis, they want to protect their nationals, so they bring in these policies. Once the economy improves and there is no threat of a crisis, then these nationalization sentiments kind of die down a little bit, and then there is more opportunity for migrant workers. So far, I don't think these nationalization efforts can be, they are getting stronger over time, but still it is not, I think, really going to displace all the migrant workers from the Middle Eastern region. And I think you talked about the gig economy. I think that's a good, interesting point, because now with the pandemic and the opportunity to work from home and remote workers having, some of the employers realize that we don't really need some of these migrant workers to be in the Middle East or be in whatever the country. So therefore, there is opportunity coming up for these gig economy type of workers, remote workers, working from home type of arrangements. So that might change the dynamics. But then again, not all jobs can be done remotely. Not all jobs are gig type of jobs. So right now, the bulk of Sri Lankan workers are lower skilled workers. So lower skilled manual type of work is hard to be done in a remote setting. You have to be there to do the caregiving for a patient, or to do the caregiving for a little kid, or for the cleaning. If it is a cleaning industry, you have to be in the building to clean the building. There is limited things you can do remotely. So on that note, I think still there will be some opportunity. And I think another point that you touched on was very interesting, how people are trying to go through illegal methods, I think, and getting into vulnerability. And we have seen in Sri Lanka in recent months, there's been a number of attempts to go overseas by boat, by paying to people smugglers, and people are falling victim. Some people knowingly take the risk. Some people don't know the gravity of the risk they're taking, and they're attempting to go because some are desperate to get out of this economic crisis. So in that context, people might get into a worse situation. There might be exploitation, there might be abuse, and they might not end up having a job, and they would have sold all their assets and try to make passage. So they might be in a real worse off situation. So in that sense, people have to be educated. Now there is a drive for greater migration from Sri Lanka, but it's important to do it in a safe way. There's something called safe migration, safe and regular migration. You know, these GCM objectives, the SDGs also focus on safe and regular migration. So there has to be some education, some dissemination of information of the importance of safe and regular migration so that you can achieve the objectives of migration and you can actually come to a better place than where you are rather than getting into a worse off situation. So it is very critical. When people are desperate, they become very vulnerable, they become very gullible, and opportunist people, corrupt people can exploit them. So it is important to ensure that they are well knowledgeable about the migration process and they go through a fair, safe process to ensure the best outcomes. Did I answer you?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, ma'am. We will take the last questions. There's a question from Nisha. How can Sri Lanka diversify its economy from tourism, as it is going to take time to revive tourism industry due to COVID and other situations? So how can Sri Lanka diversify to minimize its over-reliance on tourism?
Diversify within tourism or diversify away from tourism?
Outside, away from tourism.
Okay. Now that is a difficult situation because a lot of investment is already made into the tourism industry because it was a very lucrative and thriving industry before these two shocks came. And export industry is also kind of suffering with this ongoing situation. So I think we have very limited options. One good option is the BPO option. IT and BPO option is business process outsourcing, so that we can earn more foreign exchange through that. And in the current context, just like we discussed before, not all migrants have to go overseas to perform the job. Some of them can be here and perform the job, so and still earn foreign currency. So that is one way we can diversify, but there's a catch. For BPO and that type of remote work, we have to have reliable connectivity. We have to have power. We have to have internet. So the employer has to be convinced that the worker in Sri Lanka has the infrastructure to do his job for his shift uninterrupted. Right now, I don't know whether any employer will be convinced with that, because I was also praying that I will not get a power cut during this presentation and suddenly have to go all blank to you all. But so that is the situation. So to diversify away and to maybe reap the benefits or the potentials of the BPO sector, we have to have good infrastructure, IT infrastructure, reliable, uninterrupted connectivity. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. There's one more questions. Let's take this question and then we will wind up this discussions. How has the neighbor India and China had an international community responded to the crisis to help Sri Lanka to overcome this crisis? Yeah, this should be the last.
They have helped us immensely. If the support from our neighboring countries, especially those who have given us very generously at the time of our need had not come, I think Sri Lanka would have collapsed and hit rock bottom long time ago. So I think those credit lines for fuel kept the country going, kept the economy doing at least the little bit that it can do. So it is highly appreciated and it was very timely, and it is so thoughtful and so sweet of our neighbors and other distant countries also. Many countries have helped out. I think once this IMF seal endorsement is there on Sri Lanka, there will be more and more countries willing to help, and help will come when we can signal that we are committed to change and we will improve and not go into the same spiral of things all over again.
Yeah, thank you. Here we come to the end of the discussion. Thank you, Dr. Bilesha, for your insightful presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, here we come to the end of the discussion. I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to our esteemed guest, Dr. Bilesha Weeraratne, for her insightful presentation and remarks. We are truly honored to have you with us, ma'am. A big round of applause and thanks all goes to all the participants who made the event successful. We hope to have you all again in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody, for taking time to listen and also engaging with me. I enjoyed it as much as you all did. Thank you again. Bye-bye.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.